everyone. Hey everyone, we're trialing out some new software this session. So I just want to check if you can all hear me okay. So welcome to this Cemoh University session. I'll be talking about responsive logos. I'm Shanelle. Nice to meet you all. My background, I met Simon and Matt a couple of months ago. My background is in graphic design. I've been working with some really big clients over in London for a few years, and then I've moved back to Brisbane, and I've decided I quite like working in the small to mid range business market. It's a little bit different from working for large companies and corporates. And there's a little bit more versatility and a bit more fun to be had in the role. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to be talking about responsive logos today and what's changed with branding and logo systems over the past few years and why responsive logos have become so important. So before we jump into responsive logos, we need to kind of have a little bit of a talk about what the difference between logos and branding is. So just to make sure everyone's on the same page there. Branding is much more than your logo and your visual design. It kind of encompasses all things communication, where it be colors and styles, and all of the interactions that we have with our customers to make them feel a certain way, and messages and the messaging that we talk to our customers with. And it's changed a lot over the past few years. It used to be that, let me change my slide here. Actually, let's just jump into what we want to achieve overall with this session. I do want to kick off with letting everyone know that about the differences between logo and brand identity, and why it's important for everyone to understand these things, and why it's important for everybody in your business to understand what brand identity is and what part they play in that. And then we want to jump in a little bit to talk more in depth about scalable or responsive logos. And then I'm going to narrow that down a bit because it's a little bit overwhelming for small business when you look at all of the tools and assets that you need to build responsive logos and where they sit. So I just want to make sure that small business has the chance to kick off on the right foot, and they're looking at logo design with future in mind and the ability to be able to scale that across the many different systems that we use. And then I'm going to go into a little bit more depth of how to manage your responsive logo assets and the basics of what everybody needs to understand to be able to do that company-wide. So one of the key things that has changed for us in branding and logo design has actually been based on the changes in the MarTech platforms that have popped up over the last few years. So it was a few years ago that we used to have this idea that e-commerce was going to come in and take over all of our bricks and mortar stores, and that everything would move online. And while we are seeing a growth in that and the platforms that we use to communicate with our customers, like social media and e-commerce solutions, and all of that is getting a lot easier. And if you look at this slide here, you can see that there's been year-on-year growth in the number of platforms that we use to communicate with our customers. We're also seeing that e-commerce is only 9% of the total spend in the retail sector in Australia, and that's growing again year on year. They said there's about a 20% growth rate in that, and that 9% represents $27.5 billion of GDP. So that's a massive market, even though it's only 9%. And just understanding that both MarTech platforms and both e-commerce and retail sectors are still growing at this rate, what we're coming to find is that when it comes to branding and marketing, it's not that channels in general are replacing older channels, it's that we're just getting more channels that we need to deal with and more channels that we need to market across. And the rate that we do that, the frequency with which we do that is also expanding. So that's actually had quite an impact on the role that the logo plays within your brand. And I'll dive into that a little bit deeper. But first, we kind of need to understand a bit more. We need to define a little bit more what the difference between a brand is, a brand identity, and a logo as well, because it has an impact on both the wider strategic brand management perspective and also the technical implementation level. So in a wider sense of the word, your brand is the way that your company is perceived by those who experience it. So it's kind of talking about the higher level things, the intangibles. So it's your vision, it's your mission, it's your objectives, it's the values of your business. It's actually ingrained in the company culture, and it's the way that your teams interact with each other and the spirit and the collective purpose that all drives everyone within that team to create products and services for your customers. So in that sense of the word, your brand isn't really owned by you. It's not owned by a business. It's shaped by your employees. And it's also your consumers have a larger part in your brand which has been impacted by social media and the ability for this two-way communication to happen a lot more easily. So it's this experience that a brand is. It's the emotional connection it creates, and it often determines whether or not it will survive. It's how well we listen to and adapt to the needs of our audience. And I really like this quote by Marina Weller that says, "Design isn't decoration. It has to reflect the behavior of its users, and our users want to have a voice." And the reason that understanding branding and understanding the wider picture, which is your vision, your strategy, your mission, the architecture and the objectives and the personality that sits behind your brand identity, is because these perceptions are really important, and these perceptions are malleable, they're shapeable. And when we come to talk about brand identity, it's all of the little pieces that we use that sit together, the names, the colors, the logo, the illustration, the iconography, the tone that we talk to our customers with, the voice that we use, the personality that we choose to communicate with them, and the photography and the way that we structure all of these things and lay them out on the page. All of those things together bring together the personality of the brand. And it's this brand identity that acts as an aesthetic symbol, and giving this full meaning to the strategy and the vision that you're trying to communicate to your customers with. So if we now jump further down to look at your logo, we actually realize that the logo kind of performs a really small part in your overall brand identity and in your overall brand. So your logo is kind of like a visual shorthand for your brand. And you do need a logo. It helps to define who you are. But in a sense, it doesn't have the same impact that it used to. And that's just because of the sheer number of channels that we have to deal with and the frequency with which we communicate with our customers. So it used to be that your logo would form a really big part of your brand. And the reason that that has changed is that we need, with this frequency and this change with which we talk to our customers, we need to realize that our logo is seen in a lot of different canvas sizes. So, for example, if I bring it back to the sort of work that a graphic designer was doing 10 years ago, it might be that they worked on one big catalogue a year and they maybe assisted some of their salespeople with presentations, maybe on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. And then you did maybe a few campaigns throughout the year, no more than one a month. And it might be a direct mail piece or a newsletter or something like that. If you compare that to a basic digital marketing campaign that we run these days, you're looking at working across potentially organic social media, which, you know, you're aiming for probably one a day, a post of one post per day across organic social is pretty standard. You might run some campaigns. You might run an email campaign, which you do that maybe weekly or monthly, building out content pieces like white papers and blog posts and things like that. And then you might look at some of your paid marketing strategy or display ads. And each of those different canvases, each of those different assets come across in different canvas sizes. So when we kind of compare the two things together, it's that maybe we were dealing with building out 36 to 40 assets per year for a basic marketing strategy. And now if we look at that compared to, now if we combine that with what we're doing across digital, it's kind of like over 400 pieces of content that you are pushing out to customers every year. So there's just been this massive change, not only in the range of sizes that we use our logo and our branded material, but with the sheer frequency of it as well. So all of that kind of has an impact on logo design. So I just want to start off with an example of how static logos aren't working as well as they used to. If we have a look at the upside, it's quite a well-known fashion, apparel, sportswear brand. And you can see that their logo was designed to work across their apparel. When you apply that logo to their Facebook icons and some of their web stuff and their digital campaigns, that logo becomes very hard to read. And one of the key features and symbols within that logo is that little arrow. And when you come to look at that on Facebook, especially in the little chat box here, it's really illegible. It actually looks like a mistake on some of their campaigns. So there are struggles with being able to push the same logo out across many different sizes and canvases. And that's why one of the trends that we're seeing across the board is to work with responsive logos. So the example here is if you look at Heineken's logo design, original logo design with that emblem, if you start pushing that out into some of the responsive sizes that they need and looking at that comparatively, it becomes completely illegible. And that just isn't workable across any of their their digital platforms like mobile or social media. So it's responsive logo design is about removing the details for smaller devices, and it's about leaving behind the right elements of the style and the colors of the logo, so that users can recognize it instantly, and it becomes this visual hook when all of the other brand assets and the marketing materials change around it to deal with the changes in the frequency that what we have to with how we push out campaigns. So the next challenge that we have when we look at developing responsive logos is that a lot of the trend was driven by larger companies and large corporate businesses who had massive budgets to rework their logos, which is something that isn't really feasible when you're a smaller business. So when it comes to logo design, whether it's updating an existing logo or if you're building a new brand from scratch, the simplest way to implement a responsive logo is to design using a word mark and an icon in tandem. So on the right-hand side here, I've listed out some of the common types of logos that you'll generally come across. And on the left, I've got an example here of Google's latest logo update, which is just this really basic, I think it might even be Futura, like an updated, slightly tweaked version of Futura and an icon sitting right next to each other. And for a small business, working with that sort of icon and word mark set makes it more manageable for you to have a logo that will work across your mobile assets, your digital campaigns, your social media, and still be scalable to work across your print assets and something as big as a billboard. With this comes a bit of a challenge in terms of how do we manage these logos and how do we understand which logo to use where and to share it with which people in which team and who should use what where. And that kind of comes down to just having a basic design knowledge and sharing that with your team. And that means not just the marketing team as a whole, it's kind of your wider business audience. Everyone should have this understanding of basic file formats and basic design knowledge. So I just want to cover off some of the basics here, and it gets a little bit dry, but for people who aren't familiar with it, it's very important to understand the difference between these things. So there's three main things that you need to understand. There is the difference between a vector and a raster file. So a vector file is something that you can easily scale, and what it comes down to is a vector file when it's first being built is built using mathematical points, and it scales based on the relativeness of these points and how they relate to each other. Whereas a raster file is made up of pixels. So if you were to zoom in on a vector file, you could keep zooming in and it would always look smooth, whereas a raster file would start to look pixelated. And then another thing to understand, the second thing to understand with the difference between all the logo assets that end up coming out of responsive logo design is that there are different color spaces that we use for different applications. So I'll just briefly run through a couple of these. So commonly when you're working on digital files, you will work within the RGB color space. And the reason this was developed is that RGB stands for red, green, and blue. And it's quite a large colour space. If we look at this diagram on screen, you can see that the human eye sees a lot of variation in colour. And we can't duplicate that easily on screen and in print. So RGB is how we build out colours on screen. Hex is actually a smaller subset of RGB colour space, and it is built, technically it's built on an 8-bit RGB encoding, but you just need to understand that RGB and hex, they're both on-screen colours. When it gets to print-based work, CMYK stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and key, and they're the different plates that we use in printing. So it'll be blue, pink, yellow, and black. And with RGB, with CMYK, you can't replicate as many colours as what you can do in the RGB space. Pantone colours are actually, if you think of Pantone colours as the same as if you go to the hardware store and pick up a paint swatch, it's a pre-mixed colour. And mono and reverse is something that we used to use a lot and still do use a lot across print applications, but it's also important to note that sometimes your logo will actually look different in a mono application and a reverse application. So I've just included this Lions logo here to show a mono, which is a fully black logo, and then what I would call a reverse logo, which is the imprint of the same logo in a one color application. Just so if you were to reverse the white on black, it would look very strange. So they actually outlined that logo instead so that it works on a black background. And the reason that these colorways still exist is if you were to do embroidery or have a one color print job, you still need to be able to have access to these logo files. And the last thing that makes up a part of understanding which of the file types that you have that you work with for your logo is understanding the file extensions. And in general, your AI, your PDFs and your SVG and EPS files are vector files. So those are ones that are scalable. And usually a PDF file, you can view that across all of your different applications. An AI file is generally something that you'll need to open with an Adobe program, Adobe Illustrator, but that's your raw file that the logo will have originally been drawn in. When it comes to JPEGs and PNGs, those are both raster-based files, so they're not easy to scale. But what is great about those two versions of your logo files is that they're easily interpreted across a bunch of different programs. So your JPEG file can be used in Microsoft Word, it can be used in an Adobe program, it can be used online, it can be printed out. So understanding that some people don't have access to the same programs and platforms that you do will help you understand which files to use in which cases. And I've just gone down and broken this down into further categorize things based on the person using the file. So generally, if you're working with, say, a t-shirt maker or your events graphic planner, like doing trade shows, signage, flyers, things like that, you will send them a vector-based file, which is either a PDF or an EPS. Generally speaking, EPS files have gone out of favor just because everybody has access to PDF readers these days. But you might actually find that dealing with manufacturers overseas, they still rely on EPS files to produce artwork. Developers generally prefer to work with SVG files because they're scalable. PNG and JPEG files are great for them as well. I would prefer PNG files because they have transparency. You can create them with and without transparency, but your PNGs will likely be less, will have a smaller file size than what your JPEG will. And designers will usually work with PDFs and raw AI files. And for clients, working with JPEG, PDF, and PNG is probably the preference, just because you tend to work with a lot of Microsoft programs or PowerPoint, things like presentation software as well. And all of those pieces of software can easily read PDF and JPEG and PNG files. The caveat I would say is that never use a PNG file for a print application, because PNG files actually only store RGB color space. So when it comes time to convert over to CMYK, you might get a few funky color things happening. So just to finish up, was there any questions from anyone? No? Okay, guys, thanks for joining. I'll end the session now. Cheers.